January 1944. The mountains of central Italy lie drowned in mist and winter rain. The air smells of mud, diesel, and cordite. Along a ruined farmhouse near Cassino, American infantry press close to the earth, pinned by German machine gun fire rattling from a concrete pillbox dug into the hillside. The men whisper across the mud, waiting for a signal that never seems to come. Then, a low hiss breaks the silence. A soldier rises, burdened by a strange metal cylinder strapped to his back. Two nozzles glint in the gray light. He squeezes the trigger. A jet of liquid fire surges forward, a searing tongue of flame that leaps 20 yards and crawls across the bunker slit. Inside, the German defenders scream as the air itself seems to ignite. Within seconds, the firing stops. Smoke rolls outward, thick and chemical. When the silence returns, it carries a new kind of terror, one born not of bullets or shells, but of something alive and unstoppable. It was here, on the cold slopes of Italy, that German soldiers first faced the American flamethrower. The weapon that sent fire across the fields of Italy in 1944 was not new. The idea had haunted soldiers since the trenches of the First World War. Back then, German pioneers carried clumsy fuel tanks and rubber hoses into no man's land, igniting walls of flame that terrified Allied troops at Verdun and the Somme. The weapon's effect was more psychological than physical. It broke the spirit before it broke the body. After the armistice, the world recoiled from such images. The flamethrower faded into silence, remembered only in manuals and nightmares. But by the late 1930s, the world was once again preparing for a war of fortifications. Concrete, steel, and entrenchments returned. Across Europe, engineers studied how to burn defenders out of bunkers without destroying the structures that armies needed to capture. The Germans refined their Flammenwerfer 35 and later the compact 41 model, lighter, more portable, and brutally efficient. The Soviets followed. The British tested prototypes but deployed few. The United States, however, entered the race late. Before Pearl Harbor, American doctrine saw little use for a weapon that required a man to stand exposed within 50 yards of an enemy position. Training focused on rifles, machine guns, and grenades, the tools of maneuver, not siege. Yet reports from the Pacific and from Allied observers in Europe changed minds. The Japanese, defending coral atolls and caves, created problems that ordinary explosives couldn't solve. The Army Corps of Engineers was tasked with finding a way to deliver controllable fire into tight spaces. In 1942, at the Chemical Warfare Service laboratories in Edgewood, Maryland, and at the Navy's Research Center in the Panama Canal Zone, American scientists began experiments with compressed nitrogen, specialized fuel mixtures, and magnesium igniters. The result, by 1943, was the M1 flamethrower, soon followed by the improved M1A1, and later the more balanced M2-2. These models had two cylindrical fuel tanks and a smaller central gas tank, weighing around 70 pounds when full. The stream could reach 40 yards, short, but lethal. The flame's temperature exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, instantly consuming oxygen in bunkers or trenches. Each infantry division received a small number of flamethrowers, usually assigned to engineer units trained for demolition and assault tasks. The Army knew this weapon was dangerous not only to the enemy but to its operator. A single bullet could ignite the fuel. To most soldiers, the idea of carrying one was almost suicidal. Yet volunteers were found, often younger, stronger men with steady nerves. They trained for weeks, learning how to move low, how to approach pillboxes under cover, and how to switch from burst to continuous flame. The first live-fire exercises stunned onlookers. The flame jets roared like engines. The ground vibrated under the heat. Officers noted its unprecedented moral effect. Some compared it to heavy artillery at close range, others to biblical destruction. But for all its terror, the flamethrower was still a tactical tool, limited, cumbersome, effective only at short range. Its true role would emerge on the battlefield, not in training fields. By late 1943, as the Allies advanced through Sicily toward mainland Italy, American commanders began considering the use of flame in European combat. The Germans had already seen British Churchill Crocodile flame tanks in development, but not yet the portable American version. Italian villages, often fortified stone by stone, provided ideal testing grounds. The terrain, steep ridges, stone bunkers, and narrow farmhouses converted into machine gun posts, demanded weapons that could reach defenders hidden behind walls. The U.S. Fifth Army under General Mark Clark took note. So did the 36th Texas Division and the 34th Red Bull Division. Both would soon carry the new weapon northward. The final training sessions took place near Naples and Salerno in late 1943. Engineers from the 109th and 337th Regiments practiced clearing mock pillboxes. The men learned to coordinate with Thompson gunners and bar teams that would cover them as they advanced. Each flame burst lasted only 2 seconds. A short hiss, a roar, then silence. It was enough. The weapon devoured sandbags, splintered wood, and sent black smoke curling against the Italian sky. What the tests could not prepare them for was the moment when they would face another man inside the fire. By early January 1944, as the Allied line pushed toward Cassino, the M1A1 flamethrowers were officially distributed. A handful of operators carried them forward under engineer platoons attached to infantry companies. No one in those units yet knew what the Germans would think, or how they would respond, when the first jet of American fire erupted across the battlefield. And so the stage was set. A weapon born in laboratories, carried by young men into ancient hills, now meeting an enemy that once pioneered the very terror it would face to be why the winter of 1943–44. The Italian front had become a slow, grinding crucible. The Allied advance north from Naples had stalled before a series of ridges and river lines that the Germans had turned into a labyrinth of concrete and wire, the Gustav Line. Every valley was mined, every approach zeroed by artillery. And at its heart stood the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, commanding the road to Rome. Here, the U.S. Fifth Army faced the German 10th Army under General Heinrich von Wiettinghoff, supported by the veteran Fallschirmjäger of the 1st Parachute Division, disciplined, well-dug, and fighting for every inch. Their defense relied on pillboxes and strongpoints built from local stone, their walls several feet thick, often connected by trenches invisible from the air. For the Americans, this was not a war of maneuver anymore. It was a war of inches. Artillery alone could not dislodge the defenders. Shells shattered rooftops but left the bunkers intact. Air bombardment blackened the hills yet failed to root out the men inside. The Germans had mastered the art of surviving bombardment, emerging after each attack to reoccupy their firing positions. Engineers called these places rats' nests. Infantry called them something worse. The need for a weapon that could reach inside, that could burn through firing slits and smoke out machine gunners, became desperate. The flamethrower, once viewed as a crude tool of trench warfare, suddenly promised a solution. American engineer units began to study German fortification patterns. Reports from captured prisoners described their standard layouts: overlapping fields of fire, communication trenches leading to underground chambers, and heavy reliance on milligram 42s. The German manuals recommended the use of counterfire from neighboring bunkers rather than quick evacuation, a tactic that made them deadly but also trapped them when flame entered the equation. To the Americans preparing for Cassino, it meant that each bunker would have to be taken at point-blank range. Demolition teams with satchel charges and flamethrowers became the spearhead of assaults. They trained to advance under smoke cover while riflemen and bar gunners pinned down apertures. It was grueling work, slow, precise, and terrifying. Meanwhile, on the German side, the very idea that the Americans might use flamethrowers in Italy seemed almost unthinkable. Intelligence briefings mentioned British flame tanks seen in Sicily, but portable flame units were not yet associated with American infantry. The German 10th Army expected explosives, not fire. When those first bursts came, their effect would be as psychological as physical. Behind the lines, the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service had quietly prepared fuel supply chains. The mixture, known as Napalm BS early variant, combined gasoline with a thickening agent, aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids, producing a sticky, burning gel that clung to surfaces. In 1944 it was still in limited issue, but even the older fuel, ordinary gasoline mixed with rubber compound, burned long enough to fill enclosed spaces with carbon monoxide and flame. The effect was catastrophic in confined bunkers. Every detail of the new weapon was studied. A single operator with the M1A1 could deliver about 10 one-second bursts before his tanks ran dry. The weapon's range, about 40 yards, meant he had to crawl dangerously close. Flame pressure was controlled through compressed nitrogen at 500 psi. Ignition came from a pair of pyrotechnic cartridges mounted on the nozzle, small magnesium flares that could fire for seconds at a time. To protect the operator, his companions laid down suppressive fire from all directions. It was coordination under fire, chemistry, physics, and raw nerve combined. When the 36th Infantry Division prepared for its next offensive across the Rapido River, a handful of these flamethrowers were issued to engineer detachments attached to the assault companies. Their mission was clear: breach the German bunkers protecting the approaches to Casino and clear the way for infantry. No one could predict how it would unfold. Many had seen flame used in training, but none against living men. Among Allied commanders, opinions differed. Some saw the flamethrower as a necessity of siege warfare, others called it barbaric. Reports from the Pacific described how Japanese soldiers, trapped in caves, often chose suicide over surrender once flame was employed. Would German soldiers react the same way? Would the weapon break their morale, or would it harden their resolve? No one yet knew. In January 1944, as the weather worsened and the offensive loomed, a handful of American engineers packed their gear, rifles, satchel charges, and the new flamethrowers, and moved toward the riverbank. Across the mist, German bunkers waited. Machine guns were already sighted. The hills echoed with the rumble of artillery preparing to open fire. Soon, both sides would discover what happened when modern engineering met ancient fear. They called them flame men. In training rosters and after-action reports, their names were often listed only by initial, the Army's quiet way of concealing the most dangerous job in the platoon. Each flamethrower operator carried 70 pounds of fuel, metal, and compressed nitrogen across terrain where one rifle bullet could turn him into a fireball. Yet they went forward, sometimes by volunteering, sometimes by order, always under fear. A flamethrower operator's life expectancy in direct combat was measured in minutes. The weapon made him a prime target. German snipers learned quickly to watch for the distinctive twin cylinders and the thick hose leading to the nozzle. American comrades learned to shield him, calling for covering fire from bars and Garand rifles as he crawled ahead. Communication was simple: a hand signal, a shouted word. Once he fired, the sound drowned out everything. Many operators described the same sensation: a sudden silence just before ignition, followed by an eruption that felt alive. The fuel ignited in a bright, rolling wave. The air shimmered, the pressure slammed into the chest, and the smell, an acrid mixture of gasoline, smoke, and burning paint, clung to their uniforms for days. Some men said the flame's roar made them forget fear. Others said it burned into memory forever. What distinguished these soldiers was not aggression but focus. They were technicians as much as fighters. They knew the nozzle angle, burst duration, and fuel pressure by instinct. 1 second too long, and oxygen depletion would backflash into the barrel. Too short, and the target would survive. Few spoke about what they saw after: the aftermath inside bunkers, the charred remains, the silence that followed. Most kept those images locked away, mentioned only in veteran reunions decades later. Yet among infantry units, the flamethrower operator earned a strange respect. He carried no long-range weapon, relied entirely on his comrades, and stood at the point of the assault. In reports from Casino and later Anzio, commanders noted that morale rose when a flame team was present. They gave confidence, one lieutenant wrote, that nothing ahead could stand for long. Still, the burden was immense. Some operators refused to carry the weapon twice. Others became so skilled that they were kept alive almost by command: too valuable, too irreplaceable. It was a brutal paradox. The man most likely to die was also the one his platoon could least afford to lose. 2. The tactical angle. The flamethrower was never a general-purpose weapon. It was a key for a very specific lock: the fortified position. In Italy, that meant German Tobruk pits, milligram nests, and stone farmhouses converted into miniature fortresses. The weapon's range, roughly 40 yards, required intimate coordination between engineers, riflemen, and armor. Typical tactics formed quickly. 2 rifle squads would suppress the bunker. An engineer with satchel charges would approach one flank, and a flamethrower team would close in from another. Flamethrower assaults often began under the cover of smoke. Once close enough, the operator would deliver short, sharp bursts into firing slits or doorways. The fuel, liquid at first, would atomize in the air and then ignite, flooding interiors with both heat and oxygen-starved fumes. It was not always instant death. Many bunkers turned into lethal traps, the flame consuming oxygen faster than fire itself could spread. Survivors sometimes stumbled out, choking and disoriented, into the path of waiting riflemen. At Casino, these tactics evolved into doctrine. After several early failures where operators were cut down before reaching range, units adopted combined approaches, a 1-2 punch of explosives and flame. First, engineers blasted the outer wall with a shaped charge, then flame followed through the breach. The effect was devastating. Commanders noted that the weapon's greatest value lay not only in physical destruction but in suppression. Once the flame appeared, even adjacent bunkers ceased fire, fearing the next jet might find them. German coordination broke down. The terror of being trapped in fire was stronger than orders. For that reason, U.S. reports often listed flamethrower employment as moral neutralization, a term both clinical and grim. Still, flame was difficult to sustain. Each burst consumed precious fuel. Tanks emptied in seconds. Resupply was nearly impossible under fire. The operator had to withdraw, refill, and return, if he survived long enough to do so. That limitation confined flamethrowers to short engagements. Against open terrain, they were useless. Against stone and steel, they were gods of war. 3. The technological angle. Behind every burst of fire was careful engineering. The M1A1 flamethrower weighed roughly 70 pounds filled, 50 empty. Its 2 fuel cylinders held 4.75 gallons of thickened gasoline, pressurized by a smaller nitrogen tank. A flexible hose connected the tanks to the wand-like projector, ending in a nozzle fitted with dual magnesium igniters. Each igniter cartridge burned for up to 7 seconds. The design evolved rapidly in the field. Operators improvised shields from scrap metal, wrapped hoses in canvas to prevent snags, and learned to fire in bursts of no more than 2 seconds to conserve fuel. The M2-2 model, introduced in early 1944, improved balance and ignition reliability. Still, maintenance was constant. Fuel leaks, clogged igniters, or faulty valves could turn the weapon into a death trap. Chemical engineers had also improved the fuel. Standard gasoline mixed with rubber compound produced a sticky flame that clung to surfaces. Early napalm blends made it worse, or better, depending on perspective. Instead of a quick flash, the gel burned slower and hotter, seeping into cracks and fortification vents. It created not just destruction but denial, a space no soldier could occupy for minutes afterward. The Germans, once masters of the weapon, were surprised by the American model's simplicity. Their Flammenwerfer 41 used pressurized nitrogen as well, but it was heavier and its range shorter. The American versions traded elegance for ruggedness, easier to assemble, easier to maintain, and capable of surviving the rough handling of frontline infantry. Flamethrowers also found mechanized forms. Experimental tanks, half-tracks, and even bulldozers were fitted with flame projectors. These vehicles, such as the M5A1 Satan and later the Sherman-based Zippo, would dominate Pacific campaigns, but their early concepts were tested in Italy. Engineers saw potential in combining armor protection with sustained flame. It would take another year for that idea to mature, but the seed was planted on the Italian front. In purely mechanical terms, the flamethrower was inefficient, short range, limited duration, vulnerable operator. But in psychological and tactical terms, it changed battle rhythm entirely. Where bullets pinned men, fire uprooted them. Where shells collapsed walls, flame entered the cracks. It forced movement, broke cohesion, and filled even seasoned soldiers with a primitive dread. Point 4. The leadership angle. For the men who planned battles rather than fought them, the flamethrower presented a dilemma. On paper, it was a weapon of engineering precision, a tool to solve tactical equations of bunkers, trenches, and fortified ruins. But in practice, its use carried moral, logistical, and psychological consequences that reached far beyond the immediate battlefield. Commanders like Major General Fred L. Walker of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division saw flame as a necessity. His engineers reported that German strongpoints on the Gustav Line could survive hours of shelling. Only direct assault, one report read, will clear them. Flame and demolition recommended. From there, orders moved quietly through battalion and company levels. No publicity, no photographs, just a line in the operations log. Flamethrowers to be issued to assault platoons. Officers studied the weapon's employment from captured German manuals. The enemy, after all, had used it extensively in Russia. The consensus was simple. Flame belonged to the engineers, to be used only under direct command of the infantry leader on the spot. Too early, and it revealed itself. Too late, and the assault failed. Leadership also faced a practical challenge. A flamethrower was not just a man with a weapon. It was a system, a team, resupply chain, and coordination effort. Ammunition carriers had to bring spare fuel under fire. Protective smoke had to be laid. Riflemen had to suppress defenders without igniting their own cover. It demanded discipline and timing. At higher levels, the weapon's use was seldom celebrated. After-action reports spoke in detached language. Flame employed successfully against 3 pillboxes. Casualty numbers were rarely specified. Yet commanders noticed its impact on morale, not only among the enemy but among their own troops. Soldiers who had watched their friends die trying to storm bunkers suddenly saw a tool that could end those battles faster. That mattered. But leadership also understood the weapon's cost in perception. Propaganda units avoided filming flamethrower actions. The army wanted victory, not images of men burning. This discretion was deliberate. Even in war, some images were judged too disturbing to show. Commanders knew that a weapon could win a position and still lose moral ground. 5. The enemy angle, the German experience. When the first American flamethrowers appeared in Italy, the German response was confusion, then disbelief, then fear. The 10th Army had long experience with flame weapons of its own, but its men had not expected to see them in Allied hands, at least not portable ones. The first encounters at Casino caught defenders off guard. Field reports mention gasoline projectors and short jets of fire from infantrymen. Some believed they faced chemical weapons. German engineering doctrine recognized flamethrowers as Nahkampfmittel, close combat weapons, to be countered by distance and firepower. But on the Gustav Line, there was no distance. Pillboxes built into rock allowed no retreat. The flame entered through slits and doors. Oxygen vanished. Survivors often emerged blind, coughing, and disoriented, easy prey for rifle fire. Captured soldiers later told Allied interrogators that the psychological effect was worse than artillery. At least with shells, one said, you could hide behind something. With flame, there was nowhere to hide. Another recalled, the sound, the roar, made us think the world was ending. German propaganda units received strict instructions not to mention the new weapon. The regime feared that public acknowledgement of Allied flamethrowers might spread panic among troops on other fronts. Instead, the Wehrmacht quietly circulated technical bulletins recommending countermeasures. Wider apertures for bunker ventilation, use of sand or water barrels, and immediate evacuation once flame entered. In reality, these measures rarely worked. At company level, commanders began issuing standing orders. Any flamethrower operator captured alive was to be shot. This brutal directive was not unique. It mirrored policies seen on the Eastern Front, where both sides viewed flamethrower men as beyond the pale of ordinary combat. The Americans knew this. Many operators carried pistols or submachine guns not just for self-defense, but to ensure they would not be taken. Yet fear flowed both ways. German soldiers learned to recognize the flamethrower's silhouette even at a distance. Some fired entire magazines at a single operator, desperate to stop the fire before it reached them. Others abandoned positions the moment they saw the first burst. This reaction, more than casualties, was what the U.S. command valued most. Flame as a weapon of movement, forcing defenders to break cover. 6. the moral and psychological angle. Every war develops its own moral vocabulary. In Italy, the flamethrower introduced words no one wanted to speak aloud. Among Allied troops, opinions diverged sharply. Some saw it as a necessary evil, a response to the Germans' stubborn defense of fortified positions. Others called it too much, a step beyond soldiering. You could shoot a man, one infantryman said, but burning him felt like something else. Officially, the U.S. Army treated flame as a technical weapon, no different from explosives. Unofficially, chaplains reported increased confessions after its use. Soldiers spoke of nightmares, of faces seen through fire, of the smell that clung to their clothes. Few asked for reassignment, but many grew quieter after their first mission. From a psychological standpoint, the weapon altered not just the enemy's morale but the attackers. Its very operation required proximity, one man confronting another at 20 yards, separated only by a jet of liquid fire. There was no distance, no abstraction. Each burst was an act witnessed in full. For those who survived, that memory stayed longer than the victory itself. On the German side, the moral shock was equally profound. Many defenders felt betrayed by a weapon they once claimed as their own. During the First World War, German pioneers had pioneered flame warfare. Now they were its victims. Some Wehrmacht officers wrote bitterly in diaries about our own fire turned against us. Others admitted grudging respect for the Americans' precision and courage in using it. Outside the battlefield, ethical debate was largely absent. The world was consumed by greater atrocities: mass bombings, concentration camps, the destruction of cities. Against that backdrop, the flamethrower seemed almost small. Yet for those who saw it up close, it represented the war's descent into something older, more primal. It stripped combat of distance, returning it to the intimacy of ancient fire. Historians later described the flamethrower as both a tactical innovation and a psychological weapon of antiquity reborn, fire as judgment. In Italy, it reminded soldiers that technology had not replaced the primitive fears that ruled men under combat: fear of confinement, of suffocation, of fire itself. And on a cold morning near Cassino, those fears would ignite for real. The stage was ready, the weapons issued, the targets prepared. What had been theory, training, and moral debate was about to become action. A moment that would enter the dark lexicon of 20th century warfare. Cassino, Italy, January 17, 1944. Dawn came without light. The Rapido River lay beneath a curtain of fog and smoke from the night's artillery preparation. In the shallow water, men from the U.S. 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, crouched beside inflatable boats, their faces darkened with mud and soot. The plan was simple and terrible: cross the river, breach the Gustav Line, and open the road to Rome. To the east, German machine guns waited, milligram 42s dug into bunkers of reinforced stone. Their fields of fire overlapped the crossing zones. Mines covered the approaches. Wire entanglements glistened with frost. Each bunker was marked on American maps by a number and a nickname: Gertie, Sally, the Brewery. Each one had to be destroyed by hand. Among the engineer detachments attached to the assault companies were men carrying a new and secret burden: the M1A1 flamethrower. They had trained for weeks, but never fired the weapon in battle. The briefing was clear: advance under smoke, wait until within 30 yards, and aim for the firing slits. If the flame failed, use charges. If it worked, keep moving. There would be no second chance. At 0630 hours, the first boats pushed off. Machine gun fire slashed through the mist, shredding pontoons, cutting ropes. Men fell into the cold current. Still, some reached the far bank, crawling through reeds toward the German lines. The roar of the milligram 42s was deafening, a mechanical rhythm that pinned down entire companies. On the left flank, near a stone farmhouse overlooking the river, an engineer section of the 111th Engineer Combat Battalion moved forward under heavy fire. Lieutenant John Hale, their platoon leader, later wrote that visibility was 10 yards at best, and everything smelled of wet fuel. 2 of his men carried flamethrowers, others carried satchel charges. Their target was a bunker codenamed Gertie, from which a single milligram had stalled the entire crossing. Crawling within 30 yards, Hale's team waited for covering fire. Then, as a shell burst nearby, they rose. The first flamethrower operator, Private First Class William A. Wilson, ignited his twin cartridges. A white flash burst at the nozzle, followed by a jet of roaring fire that painted the fog in orange and black. The flame struck the bunker slit, rolled upward, and disappeared inside. The effect was immediate. The machine gun stopped. Smoke poured from the firing aperture. Wilson advanced another 10 yards, fired again, sweeping the nozzle side to side. Inside, the heat consumed everything. German reports later described the experience as a hellish blast of burning air. The defenders had no chance to escape. For the Americans watching from the riverbank, the moment was both horrifying and liberating. It was like the earth itself caught fire, one corporal recalled. The bunker ceased to exist as a fighting position. Within minutes, riflemen surged forward, passing the engineers, securing the position. That was the first recorded instance of German soldiers facing an American flamethrower in European combat, January 17, 1944, near the Rapido River, during the opening assaults on Cassino. It was not a large event in the scale of the war, but it marked a shift, a new psychological frontier. Elsewhere along the line, similar scenes unfolded. Engineers armed with flame advanced against bunkers codenamed Sally and Joe. In one case, a German crew tried to flee through a rear trench only to meet another burst of fire. Survivors were few. Those captured afterward were dazed, coughing, and silent. At battalion command, observers noted the weapon's unexpected effectiveness in reducing fortifications. They also noted casualties among the flame teams. Most were lost before reaching range. The crossing as a whole was a failure, a costly attempt to breach the Gustav line, but the flamethrowers had proven their value beyond question. Word spread quickly through both armies. For the Germans, the shock was visceral. Parachute infantry from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division later wrote in field diaries of the American fire weapon that spits liquid flame into our holes. They had faced tanks, mortars, and bombardments before, but never this. One account found after the war described a bunker where the air turned white and the skin peeled from hands before thought could react. Another, from an NCO near Sant'Angelo, recorded simply, "We heard the roar." Then silence. To the Americans, it was both triumph and trauma. Some men cheered when the milligrams stopped. Others looked away. Lieutenant Hale wrote that after the assault, the smell stayed with us the rest of the day. None spoke much on the way back across the river. By the time night fell, the Rapido crossing had cost the 36th Division over 1,600 casualties. The flamethrowers had done their grim work, but the Gustav line still held. Yet the psychological balance had shifted. German defenses were no longer invincible. A weapon older than civilization itself had re-entered modern war. And as reports reached Corps headquarters, commanders began asking for more fuel, more training, more flame. The experiment was over. The weapon had proven itself. The next battles would take it deeper into the mountains, against the most hardened positions of the German line. The reports from the Rapido reached headquarters within hours. Flamethrowers effective against enemy bunkers, read the after-action summary. Morale effect decisive. The word decisive caught the attention of every staff officer who saw it. Within a week, flamethrowers were being issued more widely across the Fifth Army's front, to engineers, to infantry platoons, and even to tank crews. But if the Rapido had been the first encounter, Monte Cassino would be the proving ground. February 1944. The monastery still stood, untouched by bombs, its ancient walls dominating the Liri Valley. Below it, the shattered town of Cassino had become a fortress, every room, every doorway, turned into a strong point. German Fallschirmjäger held the ruins with machine guns, mortars, and fanatical discipline. For the Americans and New Zealanders assaulting those ruins, every advance was measured in meters. There was no flank, no rear, only rubble, cellars, and death. Here, the flamethrower became not a novelty but a necessity. Teams advanced street by street, using the weapon as a bridge between infantry and engineering. In the narrow alleys, its roar bounced between the broken walls like thunder. The flames filled doorways, shattered morale, and turned positions that had resisted for days into infernos within seconds. The weapon's range, so limited in open terrain, now became its strength in the claustrophobic maze of Casino. One observer from the 2nd New Zealand Division described watching a German strongpoint vanish, as if the air itself caught fire. Another report noted that defenders often tried to surrender the moment they saw the twin tanks appear at a corner. Fire, more than steel, broke the will to resist. German countermeasures emerged quickly. By late February, the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division began reinforcing bunker entrances with sandbags soaked in water and covering slits with steel mesh to block the fuel stream. Snipers were ordered to target flame operators first. When that failed, some units improvised smoke screens or used hand grenades to ignite the spilled fuel around attacking troops. But the fear was already there. "We can stop tanks," one German corporal wrote, "but not fire." On the Allied side, engineers experimented relentlessly. Some combined flamethrowers with demolition charges, firing flame first to clear defenders, then blasting the structure entirely. Others learned to use the weapon to ignite smoke canisters, creating impromptu screens during an advance. The battlefield became a laboratory of terror and invention. Then came Anzio, March 1944, the beachhead that turned into a siege. Here, American forces again faced entrenched Germans across flat, muddy ground. Traditional assaults failed. Artillery duels dominated daylight, but at night, small patrols crawled across no man's land to clear out listening posts and sniper nests. Flamethrowers went with them. In one recorded patrol, men of the 1st Armored Division's engineers used a flamethrower to destroy a farmhouse that had served as a German observation post. The flame jet, fired through a window, ignited ammunition inside, producing an explosion visible for miles. German artillery retaliated instantly, but the position was gone, erased in seconds. Each use brought the same grim realization. This was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of fear. German soldiers began describing feuerteufel, fire devils, in their reports. American troops, meanwhile, started to talk about the flame guys with a mix of awe and discomfort. They cleared what no one else could, but few envied them. Even among commanders, there was unease. General Mark Clark, commanding 5th Army, privately admitted that the flamethrower was a dreadful but necessary instrument. British General Harold Alexander went further, calling it a weapon that ends all argument. For the men who had to use it, the experience was intimate and unforgettable, close, noisy, and suffocating. By the spring of 1944, German intelligence had issued specific warnings. Enemy infantry carries a fire weapon with range of 40 meters. Do not remain inside enclosed positions once flame attack begins. That sentence, "Do not remain inside," was the end of a defensive doctrine built on fixed fortifications. Fire had changed the logic of war. At Casino, the monastery was finally bombed into rubble, but the fighting continued among its ruins. Flamethrower teams moved with tanks and infantry in coordinated bursts. Where machine guns once ruled, now came jets of fire that stripped concealment from every hole and shattered every illusion of safety. When German prisoners were later interrogated, many described the same moment of paralysis. The sound of compressed gas, the sudden roar, the sense that air itself had turned solid and hot. Few remembered how they reacted afterward. The American reports noted enemy psychological collapse in localized areas. Those words masked what had really happened. Centuries of European warfare, from musket to tank, had never seen anything like this. By April, the Gustav Line had begun to crack. Fire had been one of the chisels that broke it. From Casino to Anzio, and soon to Normandy, the lessons would spread. A weapon feared, despised, yet indispensable. And as the Allied armies prepared to break out toward Rome, another question loomed over every commander, every infantryman, every engineer who carried those heavy twin tanks across the mud. If this was what it took to win, what would victory look like? By May 1944, the smoke of Casino had drifted away, leaving behind a broken landscape and a new chapter in the psychology of modern war. The monastery was gone, reduced to skeletal ruins. The Gustav line, long thought impregnable, had finally been pierced. And among the many tools that made it possible, one stood apart, the flamethrower. Reports from the Fifth Army's G2 intelligence branch described it in dry military prose. The enemy exhibits acute fear of flame weapons. Resistance in confined positions decreases significantly after initial exposure. But behind those sterile sentences lay something far more human. For German soldiers, the appearance of the flamethrower had not only introduced a new danger, it had struck at the very instinct of self-preservation. Fire was not shrapnel or bullet. It was suffocation, heat, and panic all at once. In captured letters and diaries, phrases appeared again and again: the flame men, the firestorm, the burning air. At Cassino and Anzio, units that had once fought to the last round now surrendered at the first sight of the twin tanks. Many simply fled. Others froze. The old German discipline, so reliable under artillery or bombing, faltered under fire. Veterans of the Eastern Front compared it to the first encounters with Soviet flamethrower tanks, but the American method, precise and personal, seemed even worse. Meanwhile, among the Americans, reactions were divided. Infantry units learned to call in flame teams like artillery, an answer to any position that refused to yield. Officers wrote that one burst of flame saved an hour of fighting. But for the men who carried it, the weapon was a curse. Its tanks weighed over 70 pounds when filled, and its operators were magnets for enemy fire. Snipers learned to aim for the tanks. Machine gunners concentrated on the flame men first. Casualty rates among flamethrower operators were among the highest of any specialty. The psychological burden was heavier still. Some operators refused to use the weapon except under direct orders. Others described nightmares, guilt, or numbness. In a 1944 field interview, one engineer simply said, "You don't forget what they look like after." The Army's official history would later summarize it as a weapon feared by all, the enemy and its user alike. Yet tactically, the results were undeniable. American divisions began assigning flamethrowers to assault platoons as standard equipment. Specialized training schools were established near Naples to teach safe handling, ignition drills, and coordinated tactics with infantry and tanks. By summer, the flamethrower was no longer an experimental tool, it was doctrine. German defenses adapted in turn. Commanders ordered troops to abandon fixed bunkers once flame appeared and fall back to open ground. Fortified lines grew thinner. Strong points became temporary rather than permanent. It was a quiet revolution, the end of fortress warfare in Europe. On the Italian front, reports from the 1st Parachute Division in June 1944 noted, enemy flame weapons cause more disorder than artillery. Morale drops rapidly in confined space. The Wehrmacht's countermeasure was to spread out, to decentralize its defenses, and to rely on mobility rather than static endurance. But by then, the momentum had shifted. The same fear that once belonged to Allied troops under German bombardment now ran the other way. When the Allies finally entered Rome on June 4, 1944, victory felt both triumphant and hollow. The road had been cleared not only by courage and strategy, but by the raw terror of a weapon that left nothing untouched. Soldiers marching through the city saw cheering crowds and white flags, but many carried memories of Cassino's bunkers, of stone blackened by fuel, of the smell that lingered long after flame was gone. In the quiet after the campaign, Allied medical officers noted a new kind of exhaustion among infantry. They called it combat fatigue, but it carried a specific pattern. Men who had fought in enclosed flame assaults were more withdrawn, more silent. It wasn't fear of dying. It was fear of remembering. For the German survivors, it was no different. Captured paratroopers from Cassino told interrogators that they now kept small vials of water or rags soaked in gasoline to smother flame if hit. It rarely worked. We knew it would not stop it, one prisoner said, but it made us feel less helpless. Fire had changed everything: tactics, morale, and even imagination. The battlefield would never look the same again. The Italian campaign was only the beginning. What began as an experimental weapon for engineers now spread through every Allied theater. From the rubble of Cassino to the hedgerows of Normandy and the jungles of the Pacific, the flamethrower became an unavoidable symbol of total war, where industrial precision met primal terror. After Casino, U.S. Army Command issued a directive: every infantry regiment should maintain trained flamethrower operators, supported by dedicated supply lines for fuel and ignition cartridges. The Chemical Warfare Service expanded its logistics network to keep pace, producing thousands of M1A1 units for Europe and the Pacific. In Italy, veterans who had first used the weapon were sent back as instructors. They spoke not of tactics, but of timing, the few seconds that decided whether a man lived or died. One sergeant recalled telling new recruits, "You'll never get used to it, but you'll learn to do it fast." Yet even as the weapon spread, controversy deepened. Allied war correspondents, after seeing the aftermath of flame assaults, began questioning its morality. Some wrote privately that it burns too much, too completely. The military censors often withheld such descriptions from newspapers, fearing backlash at home. Behind closed doors, generals debated the same thing. Was fire different from high explosive? Was it necessary or excessive? General George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, reportedly remarked, "War is not sanitized by the weapon, it is defined by necessity." Others disagreed. Within the British command, several officers pushed for limited use, arguing that the weapon risked hardening enemy resistance or complicating surrender. But by mid-1944, the question was already answered on the battlefield at Normandy. American and British troops storming German pillboxes along the Atlantic Wall relied heavily on portable flame units and the new Churchill Crocodile flame tank, a terrifying evolution of the concept first tested in Italy. Its range was 6 times greater, its effect catastrophic. German garrisons that had resisted for hours under artillery fire surrendered within minutes when crocodiles appeared. The lessons of Casino had become standard operating procedure, and still, the debate lingered. Combat cameramen rarely filmed flame assaults. Censors preferred artillery and tank footage. The weapon's very image was too disturbing, its moral cost too high for propaganda. For the Germans, the memory of that first encounter never faded. In 1945, Wehrmacht training manuals explicitly warned soldiers that the fire weapon is the most dreadful form of enemy attack. Captured troops from Italy later told Allied interrogators that they prayed never to face it again. One paratrooper from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division confessed, "You could fight a man with a rifle. You could not fight fire." As the Allies advanced through Europe, the flamethrowers' use continued, in bunkers along the Gothic Line, in the Siegfried defenses near Aachen, and in the dark forests of the Hurtgen. Each time, it produced the same effect: shock, paralysis, and silence after the flame died. The tactical reports always said position neutralized, but among soldiers, that phrase had a different meaning. It meant no one came out alive. By 1945, engineers had begun experimenting with mechanized flamethrowers, mounted on tanks, jeeps, and landing craft. These mechanized units could project fire over 100 yards, safely behind armor. What had once been a desperate infantry tool was now a precision weapon of assault, efficient, repeatable, and terrifying. The irony was stark. The more sophisticated war became, the more it returned to its most ancient terror, fire. And yet, by war's end, the Allies faced a reckoning. The weapon that had saved countless infantrymen by clearing bunkers had also left scars: physical, moral, and psychological. Soldiers who had used it often refused to talk about it after the war. Many veterans' memoirs mention it only briefly, with phrases like "we used flame on the last holdouts," never more. When historians later asked them why, one engineer from the 36th Division answered quietly, "Because there's no way to tell it right." In post-war Europe, the ruins of Casino were rebuilt stone by stone. The monastery, once a fortress and a target, rose again as a symbol of peace. Beneath it lay the remnants of burned fortifications, reminders of the days when fire crawled across the mountain. The flamethrower itself would survive the war, but never again hold the same dominance. The Cold War would bring new technologies: napalm airstrikes, rockets, and precision bombs, but none would match the intimacy of the weapon that demanded its user to stand within sight of his enemy. The age of fire in hand-to-hand war was ending, but its echo, and its lesson, would remain: that in every war of machines, the most terrible weapons are still the ones that speak to ancient fear. When German soldiers faced American flamethrowers for the first time, it was not just another clash of weapons, It was a confrontation between technology and instinct, between discipline and primal fear. The battlefield at Casino, soaked in rain and fuel, became a place where the limits of human endurance were tested in ways no bullet could measure. Fire had always been part of war, in torches, in burning cities, in the black smoke of industry, but never had it been carried so personally. The man who used the flamethrower, and the man who faced it, were bound by the same few yards of space, the same roar, the same moment when air itself turned lethal. For historians, the weapon would be remembered as a tactical success, a necessary tool that opened fortifications and saved infantry lives. But for those who were there, it was remembered differently. Veterans spoke of it rarely, and when they did, their words carried a strange tone. Not pride, not shame, but silence. Because flame leaves no trace of heroism. It only leaves shadowed at the ruins of Monte Cassino today. The rebuilt monastery overlooks green valleys where no fire burns. Visitors walk among memorials bearing both Allied and German names. Beneath the calm, the earth still holds fragments of burned stone and twisted steel, quiet witnesses to that moment in 1944 when the world rediscovered what it meant to fear fire again. The story of the flamethrower is not one of glory or invention. It is the story of war stripped bare, when men discovered that even in an age of tanks and aircraft, the oldest terror could still decide a battle. And perhaps that is why the memory endures. Not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it revealed, that courage and horror can live in the same heartbeat, that victory sometimes arrives through things no one wishes to remember. The flames of Casino burned out long ago, but the echo of that first roar, when German soldiers faced fire and silence followed, still lingers, carried by history, as a warning written in light.